Have you ever wondered what it's like to experience true terror? The kind that makes your heart race and sends chills down your spine. Tonight, we're diving into 3 horrifying encounters that will leave you questioning the safety of even the most ordinary places. From a quiet night at home, a peaceful retreat in the woods, to a late-night train ride, these stories will make you think twice about how safe you really are. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. These are real-life nightmares that could happen to anyone, maybe even you. Julia had always been independent, enjoying her time alone in her cozy suburban house. Her job as a freelance writer meant she could work from home, and she often spent her nights in silence, typing away at her computer with only the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the house to keep her company. One Friday evening, after a long week of work, Julia decided to treat herself to a quiet night with a glass of wine and her favorite TV show. He snuggled up on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, and dimmed the lights, settling in for a relaxing night. The weather outside was stormy, with rain tapping against the windows, adding to the comforting atmosphere. As the show played, Julia noticed a flicker in the corner of her eye, like a shadow passing across the room. She brushed it off, thinking it was a trick of the light, or perhaps just her imagination playing games with her. But as the night wore on, the strange occurrences continued. Small noises, footsteps, the creaking of floorboards began to echo through the house. At first she thought it might be the old house settling, or maybe even the wind pushing against the walls. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was moving around. She paused the TV, straining to hear through the pattering rain. Silence filled the room. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're not alone." Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. The room remained empty, but the growing sense of unease was impossible to ignore. Julia tried to shake it off. She put her phone down, convinced it was just a prank. But then, another text appeared. This one was a picture. A photo of her sitting on her couch, wrapped in her blanket, taken from somewhere inside the house. Panic surged through her veins as she jumped to her feet, scanning the room. She rushed to check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Her mind raced. Could someone have gotten inside without her knowing? She grabbed a kitchen knife for protection, her heart pounding in her chest. With trembling hands, she dialed 911. But as the call went through, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The only sound was the relentless tap of rain on the glass and her own ragged breathing. The operator answered, but before Julia could speak, a soft voice whispered from the shadows, "I'm right behind you." She froze. Slowly she turned around, but the room was empty. Her body shook as she backed against the wall, clutching the knife. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure lurking just beyond the reach of the dim light. It moved closer, its footsteps barely audible over the rain. Julia screamed and bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running into the night. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of her neighbor's house, breathless and terrified. The police searched her home but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. But Julia knew what she saw and heard. She never returned to that house. James and Emily had been looking forward to their vacation for months. The couple had rented a secluded cabin, far from the chaos of city life, nestled in the heart of a dense forest. The promise of peace and quiet was exactly what they needed after a stressful year. The cabin was everything they'd hoped for, rustic, charming, and surrounded by towering trees that whispered in the wind. There was no cell reception, but that was part of the appeal, a break from the constant noise of everyday life. The first day was perfect. They spent it hiking, fishing, and enjoying the simple pleasures of nature. As night fell, they built a fire and sat under the stars, toasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It was idyllic. But then, as the flames flickered lower and the forest around them grew darker, a strange sound broke the peaceful silence. At first it was just a rustling in the trees. James dismissed it as the wind, but Emily wasn't so sure. The noise grew louder, more distinct, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. They both turned toward the sound, their eyes scanning the thick darkness beyond the firelight. "Probably just a deer," James said, though his voice wavered slightly. Emily nodded, but her unease didn't fade. They decided to call it a night and headed inside the cabin. Hours passed, but neither of them could sleep. The forest outside seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual nighttime sounds of wildlife replaced by an oppressive stillness. Then, just as they were finally drifting off, a loud knock echoed through the cabin, jolting them both awake. James grabbed a flashlight and crept to the door, but when he opened it, no one was there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he shone the light around the porch and into the woods. Nothing. He locked the door and returned to bed, but the knocking resumed louder this time, more insistent. And then they heard a voice, faint but clear, calling their names from somewhere in the woods. Fear gripped them as the voice grew louder, closer. It was impossible. How could anyone know they were there? And why were they calling out to them by name? Panic set in. They knew they had to leave, but the cabin was surrounded by darkness and whatever or whoever was out there was waiting. They armed themselves with the only things they had: a kitchen knife and a fire poker, and made a break for the car. As they ran through the woods, the voice followed them, growing more distorted, more menacing. The footsteps, those awful, crunching footsteps, were right behind them. They reached the car and sped down the narrow dirt road, not daring to look back. The voice faded as they put distance between themselves and the cabin, but the terror lingered. They never returned to the woods again, but sometimes in the dead of night they still hear that voice calling their names. Michael worked late, often taking the last train home from the city. It was a long commute, but the quiet of the nearly empty cars allowed him to relax after a stressful day. On this particular night, he boarded the train as usual, settling into his favorite spot by the window. The car was almost entirely empty, save for a few scattered passengers. As the train rumbled along the tracks, Michael leaned his head against the window, watching the darkened landscape pass by. His eyes grew heavy, and soon he drifted into a light sleep. He awoke with a start, feeling a sudden chill in the air. The train had stopped at a small, nearly abandoned station. Michael glanced around, confused. There were no announcements and the lights in the car flickered ominously. That's when he noticed someone standing at the far end of the car. A figure, dressed in dark, tattered clothes, with their head lowered. Michael felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He couldn't remember anyone else boarding the train, and he hadn't noticed the figure before. The train started moving again, and Michael tried to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. But as the train continued, the figure remained still, not moving an inch. So Michael glanced at his watch. The train should have been arriving at his station soon, but when he looked out the window, nothing looked familiar. It was as if the train was traveling through an endless void, the usual landmark swallowed by darkness. Panic began to set in. He stood up, intending to ask the conductor what was going on. But as he approached the door to the next car, it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the figure had moved closer. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard a single footstep, but now the figure was only a few rows away, their face still obscured by shadow. He stumbled back to his seat, heart racing. His phone had no signal, and the emergency intercom was unresponsive. The train continued to hurtle through the night, and the figure drew closer with each flicker of the lights. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt, throwing Michael against the seat. The lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. The only sound was the ragged breath of something moving toward him. Michael fumbled for his phone, using its weak light to illuminate the car. The figure was gone. He blinked, trying to calm his racing heart, but then he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. The scream that tore from his throat echoed through the empty car, but no one came to help. When the lights flickered back on, the train was at his station. Michael stumbled off, gasping for air, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He never took the last train home again. These stories are more than just nightmares, they're real accounts of people who encountered something beyond explanation. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more terrifying stories. Once we hit 100 likes, we'll be sharing even more spine-chilling tales that will keep you up at night. And don't forget to comment below, have you ever experienced something you just couldn't explain?